Now, the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major, will give evidence today at the public inquiry into the infection of people with contaminated blood in the 1970s and 1980s. The disaster has been called the worst of its kind in NHS history. Almost 5,000 people with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders were infected with HIV or hepatitis C after being given a new treatment meant to improve their lives. Our health correspondent Jim Reid reports.
I suppose the biggest impact is I'm not the person I was meant to have been. You can't erase the darkness, you can't erase the fear, it's always lurking.
Mark was just a child when he was warned about a medication he'd been given. His parents were told his new treatment for a blood disorder had been contaminated with HIV.
I can't really describe the feeling, because it was like, well, first of all you question, well, why are you going to school to take exams for a future and a life you're not going to have? When your doctor says, if you're lucky, but I don't think you'll live long enough to leave school, why bother? Why?
Mark's life was saved by new HIV drugs. Others died before they could be made available. In total, 5,000 people with haemophilia were left with HIV, hepatitis or both. Many more were exposed after a blood transfusion in the 70s and 80s.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
In 2019, Mark gave evidence at the public inquiry into the disaster. Today, Sir John Major will take the same stand. The first former Prime Minister to be questioned under oath about the government's response and the approach to compensation.
It's vital. He held the highest office in the land, and I think it's going to be emotional because everything I do isn't just for me. It's all for all those little boys not here. It's for all of my friends that aren't here. It's my friends right now who are so ill they might not live to see it yet. And all we've ever wanted is the truth and justice.
I was falling asleep, I was being sick.
Melanie was another of the thousands infected when she was just 17. She was diagnosed with hepatitis C, a disease which can slowly destroy the liver, and has suffered from health problems ever since.
As soon as I found out what hepatitis C was and realised that it was impacting on my life and that I was possibly not going to see my children grow up, it has been like living without being alive. It's had a huge impact on every single victim. That feeling of it could have been avoided.
Melanie is now on a different modern treatment to control her blood disorder. Like thousands of others though, she is still living with the consequences of what happened 3 decades ago and still looking for answers so many years later. Jim Reid, BBC News.
And I'm joined now by Jason Evans, founder and chair of the Factor 8 campaign group. Both Jason's father and an uncle died after being infected with contaminated Factor 8 products. Jason, thank you very much for joining us on what is undoubtedly a significant day in this campaign. And I want you to tell me, first of all, more about your dad. And you're a campaigner now, but you were effectively campaigning with him from a very, very early age when you were brought along to meetings.
Good morning. Yes, that's right. Well, my father had haemophilia, and like the thousands we were just hearing about, he was infected with hepatitis C and HIV through these Factor 8 blood products in the 1970s and 1980s. He died as a result of his infections when I was 4 years old in 1993. And he also had a brother which he never knew, by the way, who also fell to exactly the same fate. Because of the hereditary nature of haemophilia. His brother died 3 years after he did. And as you mentioned there, yes, I mean, I was born in 1989. My father died in 1993. But during that window, you know, I would go to meetings with my dad, 2 MPs, when he was pushing for truth and justice, and here we are all these decades later, still going, still pushing, and still doing the same thing.
Yeah, all this time later. And obviously you've had to turn to your mum to learn more about what that period was like for your father, for her. If you're able to, Jason, can you share some of that with us?
Well, it was horrific. I mean, the stigma of HIV, AIDS, in the 1980s. I've had endless discussions with my mother about that time. And it was, you have to remember, AIDS started in the gay community in the US, in San Francisco. And so immediately the condition was associated with that community. And unfortunately, due to mindsets of the time, which were different to generally what they are now, there were large portions of society that saw that as a good thing. The gay plague, this was going to be the extinction, of the gay community. And some people thought that that was a good thing. And then tagged on to that, here you had another community, the Hemophilia community, who were not gay, but faced exactly the same stigma as the gay community. But also, the perception was, well, you're gay because you've got AIDS, which in itself was a difficult thing, in the 1980s. So there was almost a dual stigma there. My mother was sacked from her job. She, young, worked in a part-time bakery. The employer gave the reason that customers and staff, might be concerned that her husband, had the AIDS virus. She was fired from the job. The employer had no bones about admitting that to the local paper. My parents received threatening phone calls. The abuse was rife, throughout our community.
They went through, a nightmare on top of a nightmare, effectively. And I want to ask you, Jason, what you want to hear, what you're hoping to hear from John Major today.
Well, John Major will generally be asked about the government's response to what actually happened. So less so about, the who knew what about the risks of the infected blood products themselves, but he'll be asked about the government's response. So, for example, why wasn't there sufficient support for the families? When it came to a legal action which was brought in the late 1980s, why was it that John Major announced to the House of Commons that the government had agreed to settle that litigation, even though there'd been no consultation with the victims and families at all? And the documents suggest that that was done for quite disturbing reasons, which I think the inquiry is going to get to the bottom of. People were forced to sign away their rights to hepatitis C, a virus they didn't even know that they had in addition to HIV, for as little as £20,000 for a life. People lost their jobs, their homes, they couldn't get life insurance. The losses are immense, and John Major needs to answer as to why that wasn't addressed. And just as importantly, why wasn't there a public inquiry until now, 30 years later? We see inquiries announced into things like Hillsborough, into Grenfell, announced almost immediately, where, rightly so, but less than 100 people died. Not to minimize it, yes, inquiries should have been held into those things, but I make that point to show the contrast, that with this thousands of people were seriously harmed or have been killed, but it's took 30 years for the families to begin to get those answers. So it's a very important day, and John Major certainly will face difficult questions.
And a final question, Jason. Do you think that this inquiry will allow you to draw a line under your campaigning?
Well, we've got hearings going on for the remainder of this year. I think generally the final report of the inquiry is expected sometime next year, probably mid next year. And I think it is widely hoped that through the final report of the inquiry, the truth, the answers that we've heard through the hearings will be cemented on the official record, which is really important, that this story, what happened, it doesn't go down as the unavoidable accident that so many of us thought or were led to believe that it was. We've heard through the hearings it was avoidable. Wrong has been done. Things could and should have been done differently. These pharmaceutical companies, Bayer, Baxter, Revlon, they need to be properly brought into the frame as well. And so I think the inquiry's final report will bring that. It looks like things are going in the right direction, and ultimately we need the government, the state of today, to accept that liability, responsibility, on behalf of the state for what happened and for proper redress to be given to the victims and families.
Jason, thank you very much for talking to us here at BBC News today. Jason Evans, founder of the Factor 8 campaign group.